go. Okay. So we're going to do something kind of crazy today. And we are going to overview 3 whole chapters. Why so much? Well, like we talked the last few times we've gotten together, that we actually have all repeat in here. All this stuff back like chapters 25, 6, 7. Let's see here. Yeah, 25, 26, 27, 28. All of that is stuff that's covered in these chapters. So in those first chapters, God speaks to Moses, and in these chapters, Moses repeats it to the people. And there are a few tidbits in here that aren't in the first portion. It's not that God didn't say it to Moses, it's just he didn't write it down for that part, but as he was repeating all the stuff that was said to him, he wrote it down the second time around, a few of these things. And so to start, it talks about the giving of the people providing everything that was needed to build this. And it does say in verse 2 about how it's everyone whose heart was stirred to come and do the work. And they all brought their free will offerings, it says in verse 3 at the end, every morning. And you know, if I had to even just pick one thing to focus on in these chapters, it's that. It's something I would love to see today in all churches, that people would have a vision and an excitement about what God is doing, and that it would be on their heart to come and do the work. You know, I think it's just a logical progression in the Christian faith that you move beyond the place where you typically expect to come to church, sing, get taught, and leave. I think the typical progression for any maturing Christian is where they begin to start having it on their heart. Their heart becomes stirred at this point of maturity where they come to do the work. And even if they're going to be sitting in the pews, they're not serving in some specific ministry that Sunday, they still come to do the work. Spurgeon talked about his sharpshooters. I always like referring to them in that little story of his, but he spoke about how, again, that he would preach and he might wound the unbeliever who came. But thank God for his sharpshooters who were there in the pews and watching, and they would go in for the kill at the end of the service. You know, they would be sharing the gospel with new people. They would be looking for that person sitting by themselves and no one's talking to them, and they would go over and engage them. They would notice that the trash can is overflowing and they would take care of it. You know, there's a point where just not serving feels unnatural. And I remember what that was like for me. Pastor Dallas, who, it's weird he gets on right as I was about to mention him. I remember the first Sunday I attended Calvary Chapel Toppenish just as a church member. I had visited before to lead worship, but I had moved to the Lower Valley. Here I am in Calvary Toppenish. I'm sitting in the very front row where I always would sit when I sat in churches. And one of the first things I noticed was that the slides were all kind of wonky. Like they were really low and you couldn't see the words down at the bottom because the projector was like floor to ceiling. And there's all these lyrics down low and you really couldn't read them. And so I immediately go to the back of the church and I'm sitting there trying to edit slides on PowerPoint while still clicking the next slide at the same time. And I was helping get all the slides bumped up to where you could read all the words. I just came to come, but it's like you see a need, you fill a need. And it just was natural. And it felt unnatural to just sit there seeing there's a need. And I had the ability to fill that need. And of course, within a month or two, I think I became the worship leader there. But that's the thing is these people had it on their heart to come and do the work. Exodus 36, verse 2. And they brought their free will offerings, verse 3. No coercion, no being, pressured to sow a seed into the ministry. It's just people who love Jesus and are being fed and are being filled. They give, they serve. They cannot help but pour out what has been poured into them. So, like I said, 3 chapters. We just spent a lot of time on 2 verses. But it goes, they brought the stuff, and in verse 8, it shifts into the building of the tabernacle. So this talks about all the thing, the clasps of gold, the curtains, the loops, the coverings, the boards, the sockets. All these pieces get described really for the rest of the whole chapter with almost identical descriptions to what we read, again, back chapters 25, 6, 7 in that area. And then in chapter 37, it talks about making of the Ark of the Testimony. And then the table of showbread in verse 10, and the golden lampstand in verse 17, and the altar of incense in verse 25. And so again, he goes through and is just describing the building of all these things we've already talked about. In chapter 8, it talks about the altar of burnt offering, the altar of sacrifice. In verse 8, it mentions the bronze laver. And I think that it was something that was not mentioned back there. Now, it's not that he didn't have the instructions. I think we mentioned as we went through those chapters, it's like, why is the bronze laver not mentioned? Where is it? Like chapter 27. Chapter 27 is the altar of burnt offering. It talks about the court. Then it goes in and talks about the lampstand, but it never mentions the laver. Well, that's okay. It gets mentioned here. So it's, again, there are some things that are different between the chapters. But here in verse 9 of chapter 38, it talks about the making of the court. And then it gives some specifics in verses 21 to 31 of chapter 38. It goes through and just talks about some of the things that were brought, like the gold that was brought in verse 24 was 29 talents and 730 shekels, was just over 1 ton, 2,000 pounds of gold. The silver was about 4 tons. It gets mentioned in verse 25. And in verse 29, it mentions the bronze, which is about 1.5 tons. And you'd think, gold is the most valuable, so there's less of it than silver. But then why is there less bronze? Well, it's also worth noting that only the things outside the tabernacle were bronze. The things in the tabernacle were gold. It's the same with the temple. Bronze symbolizes judgment, and it's all outside of the temple, outside the tabernacle. Gold represents deity and purity, and that's what's on the inside of the tabernacle. Silver is judgment, and all the sockets and everything that held up the tabernacle was made of silver. And so it's fascinating how there's all this typology built in to all of this. Now, chapter 39 finishes with the priests, and again, the parallel chapter that we already went through in great detail would be chapter 28. And so in chapter 39, it lists off the making of everything, the ephod, the breastplate, the other garments, right? And as you go through this, and it kind of does like a wrap up in verses 32 to 43. So again, we're just knocking out 3 chapters this morning. But in chapter 39, I've got one thing highlighted repeatedly as a reminder. In verse 1, the last line, it says, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Last line in verse 5, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Verse 7, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Verse 21, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Verse 26, as the Lord had commanded Moses. Verse 29, as the Lord had commanded Moses. And verse 31, as the Lord had commanded Moses. In fact, verse 32, it says, thus all the work of the tabernacle and the tent of meeting was finished, and the children of Israel did according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses, and so they did. Guys, the emphasis, actually verse 43, one last verse. Well, actually, verse 42. According to all the Lord had commanded Moses, so the children of Israel did all the work. Then Moses looked over all the work, and indeed they had done it as the Lord had commanded, just they had done it, and Moses blessed them. So maybe 2 big application takeaways today was that first part. And serving is just logical. Back when we were back in the beginning of chapter 36, verses 2 and 3, everyone whose heart was stirred, they came and did the work. Once God matures you to a certain point, it just feels unnatural not to serve, not to get plugged in, not to be doing something. And even again, if it's your day to sit in the pew and not serve in tech, not serve in children's ministry, not be a greeter, not be on the worship team, not be a whatever, well, oftentimes that's when you're just walking around and you're ministering to people. And you go to church not expecting to only be filled, but to do a little bit of the filling yourself. And then over here, we notice this last chapter. Chapter 40 is the last chapter of Exodus, guys. So we got to like decide what book we're going to next. Don't make me start a topical series. And so, but with chapter 39, as it's wrapping up the book of Exodus, this repetition 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8-ish, 9-ish times, 7 times word for word, as the Lord had commanded Moses, we find that God has given us instructions. They are found in the Word of God. And if we're going to do church, we ought to do it as the Lord has commanded. And so he's commanded us to gather. That's Hebrews 10 all the way, right? That we should not forsake, but we should gathering. And all the more as we see the day approaching, which sure seems like right now. In fact, ironically, the sun just started coming out, right? As I said that, as the day approaches and the sun starts shining into this room the moment I say it. Guys, more and more we need to be gathering together. I don't think Sunday only Christianity is going to cut it in the end times. We need each other, and we need each other often. We need to be coming together, doing the things God's commanded us to do with willing hearts and serving one another and the needs of the body at large. So if you guys have got ideas for what book to study next, my only requirement I ever throw out is that it has to be a book that I have taught before. That way I've got like a little bit of notes and highlights in my Bible, that make it easier for me to, well, as I do, we don't prep for these messages. This is just sit it and get it. I open my Bible and hopefully you open yours, and we find what there is for today. So God bless you guys. Have an amazing day. I don't know, Joshua or Judges sounds kind of good. You guys take care, and I will see you guys around. Don't forget to post some comments about a book you'd like to study. Just saying.